Okay, so now we've got this basic setup. What I want to do is, let's take a look at our example. I want to first start by setting up this sticky navigation at the bottom. And the reason for that, if you remember by looking at our HTML up here, is that it is actually the first thing that we encounter. All right, so on line 12, we've got this nav and it has an ID of global nav. And the reason it's called global nav, right, if you remember IDs, you can make any name up you want. But a lot of times, if something is, I refer to as a global navigation bar, then I will give it an ID of global nav so that I know that it's going to always be this one element that is unique, right? It's the global navigation that would appear on every page, uh, typically always going to be in the same place, so that people are oriented to the page and they know where to find the navigation easily. All right, so as a reminder, even though this is at the very top linearly of the HTML, we are going to make it, push it basically to the bottom of the page so that it stays there in a fixed position. And the reason that we're going to do that is, if you remember, because if we want to make this mobile friendly, one way that we can approach that is we can put the buttons in a place that are going to be really easy for somebody to hit with their thumb if they're holding their phone in the, at the bottom of their phone. And that's a really common place for people to want to be able to touch. It's not necessarily a best practice or anything like that. It's just one way that I'm going to show you an option. And more you'll see a lot of web pages actually create a page that looks very similar on a regular full-size desktop screen as you will on a mobile device like a phone or small tablet. So anyway, what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and target this ID of global nav, and we'll make a CSS rule for that. So I'm going to pull this up a little bit so we can see more of our CSS. And down below the body, I am going to make an ID for global nav. And make sure you spell this right, all right? Because if you don't, then it's not going to work. And I'm not going to do, I could do like nav, nav, global nav, but I don't have to because it's an ID. Remember that you'd only ever use an ID one place on the page. So as a result, I don't really have to necessarily make it a descendant rule or even a rule of specificity in this case. I can just call it out by the ID name because there's only one instance of it. So let's go ahead and do that. And the first thing that I'm going to do, if we want to make it look like this, on our page, let's jump over here and let's take a look at the way it looks right now, which is still at the top of the page and it's gigantic, is I want to go ahead and tell it to be attached to the bottom. So I'll do the position, let's do that, and I'm going to say fixed. All right, and so far it changed a little bit, and you see that now it's fixed in that it doesn't scroll, right? But that didn't change anything else about the size or what have you, right? So the next thing that I want to do is I want to say that it is going to be, let's go ahead and give it a specific height for right now. And let's just say that it's going to be like 90 pixels tall for right now. All right, and you'll see that it still looks the same. You might be wondering why it still looks the same, and that's because even though I gave it a height of 90 pixels, the pictures are going to be as big as they need to be, and they're going to take up their space in width, not in height. So if I wanted then to make the global nav a certain width, I could go ahead and tell it, even though it's already sort of behaving this way, I'll say that the width is 100. You could either say 100% or 100 viewport width, which is VW. All right, so I'll say width is 100 VW for viewport width. All right, and all right, still basically looking the same. And the other thing I need to do is I need to tell it to be attached to the bottom and to the left. All right, so we'll say bottom, and remember this is the offset. It's not margin bottom or anything like that, it's just bottom. I'll say bottom 0, and then you'll see that it jumped down at the bottom, okay, all right. And then we will go and say left 0, like that. And you might be thinking, well, now I can't see anything except for the top you know, down here you can see the top of the logo, but that's because we need to actually tell the logo like how big to be. All right, so and the other thing that we can do is we can give this a background color so that we can distinguish it from the other things. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say background, and I'm going to give it like a 222 color, so it's like a dark color. It could be some other color, that's fine. And now you'll see that it's at least fixed in the same position. I could also give it a top border. Let's do that. Let's say border top. Let's go ahead and, oops, sorry, border dash top. And I'm going to give it this, let's just call it magenta, and I'll come back and I'll figure the color out. And I will say, let's do 2 pixels or 3 pixels or something like that, and let's make it solid. Okay, and then you see that it pops up. Oops. All right, and I don't necessarily want it to be that color, so if I come over here, I can do a right click, and I can say edit. I do a quick edit, and then I can find the color that I actually want. Okay, and I think I like that color. I'll go ahead and close that. One thing right off the bat that you'll notice is that it still looks blue over here, this border, and that's because I've got it selected over in my HTML. If I select something different, you can start to see the border a little bit better. And just so that it's a little bit easier to see, I'm going to go ahead and make this, instead of 3 pixels, let's make it like, I don't know, like 8 pixels, and you can see that border a little bit better for that sticky navigation. All right, so now we've got our sticky navigation in place. It just doesn't look very good. So we need to style the stuff that's inside of it. So let's take a look at the way that this is set up, right? We've got this anchor tag, and it has logo bottom ID attached to it, and then inside of that is an IMG. So we can target that IMG to tell it exactly how big to be, because it is inside of something that's got an ID on it, right? So we could come down here and we could say the ID name is logo-bottom, so we could look for any instance of an image that's inside of logo bottom. So let's look here, and we'll say logo-bottom, and then put a space for an IMG, right? So that tells me right off the bat that I am targeting this picture file, because it is the picture file, the IMG tag, that is inside of the logo bottom ID, right? And we can tell it to be a width. Let's just start off by saying like 70 pixels or something like that, right? And then you see that it gets a lot smaller over here. And because it's an SVG, it's you know, it doesn't lose any kind of quality when you scale it. Now it's a little bit a little wonky right now because it's sitting right up in the top corner. So what we can do is we can tell this image to be, first of all, let's say display block, so that we don't have any weird spacing underneath it. We'll say display block. And because that picture file up here is inside of the anchor, though, I don't want to set the position for the image separate from its anchor link, right? I want to make sure that they travel together as a unit if they go somewhere, like if I tell it to be a certain position, right? So I'm going to actually create a different rule that is just for the logo bottom, right? Because that is attached to that anchor tag, right? Logo bottom ID is attached to an A tag. So I know that if I style logo bottom, I'm actually styling anchor link, right? All right, so that's something to be really aware of. So if I go down here and say logo bottom, I'll do my opening and closing curly braces, and I can tell this to be a certain position if I want. Like I can tell it to be absolute, and the reason that I can tell it to be absolute and have it still stay down here inside of this global nav area is because its parent is a fixed position. So absolute will listen to 2 different types of parent positions. I already told you once before that if its parent happens to be relative, that absolute will follow its parent around wherever you put the parent on the page, right? The same is true if absolute is inside of something that is also fixed. All right, so, and to extend that even a little further, technically, if you put an absolutely positioned thing inside of something else that's absolutely positioned, it will still also follow around that element. But the point of this is that if I put position like this and I say absolute, it will become absolute. And if I tell it, let's say top, let's tell it 8 pixels to bump it down a little bit, it bumps it down based off of its parent container edge, right? So it's bumping it down based off of this fixed global nav, all right? So top 8 pixels, and let's bump it over to the right a little bit. So we'll say left. So its left offset is going to be, let's say, 25 pixels or something. So it bumps it in a little. And I think that that might be nice in terms of like where the logo is placed, at least for right now. Maybe I don't want it bumped in that far in the future. I don't know. Let's try 20 pixels and see how that looks. Might be a little bit better. But then you'll see, oh my gosh, what's happening is you've got these other things that are sitting on top of it, and that's because, or they're actually not sitting on top of it. They're just sitting actually behind it. These list items. And because they're all white, they look like they're overlapping, and it's confusing. So let's address that now. If we go over here and we look at this UL, that's the thing that comes after that A, and the UL has a bunch of list items in it. And if you look at our example over here, let me close the Google font thing. If you look at our example, you'll see that these links are just sort of, they're floating over here, or they're not necessarily floating. The list itself is over here to the right, and we could do the same thing with the list as we did with the that logo, and we could make it absolute, because remember, the list right here is also inside of something that is fixed, and so it will be absolutely located, which means it'll scroll if its parent scrolls. In this case, its parent doesn't scroll because it's fixed, but it will be absolutely located inside of its parent container because the parent is fixed. So let's look at that. So we've got this UL. I don't have an ID on the UL, but if you remember how we did this, we end up being able to use a parent as part of its descendant identifier, right? So if I go here and the bottom, I can say, all right, well, I want the UL that happens to be inside of global nav ID. So I'll say global nav, and this is how you would write it. It's the UL that is inside of, that's what that space is indicating, the global nav ID, right? That's how you would write that descendant tree, all right, or descendant selector. So what I want to do is jump back over here so I can see what I'm doing. And for this, I will say, let's say position, and let's also say absolute. All right, and now what I need to do is I need to say right, because I want it to be attached to the right, 0. Okay, and it doesn't look like anything's happening because the picture's still taking up 100% of its available space, right? So it doesn't look like anything is changing. So if you want to be able to see how this is changing really well, then let's go back here. Let me go ahead and put a top in. We'll just say top is, for right now, let's just say top 0, and then we'll go back and adjust it. So that means that we need to adjust the sizes of these picture files, all right, that are inside of these links, that are inside of, or the picture files are inside of anchor tags that are inside of links, right? So let's come down here and make a new rule. I'm just going to copy this, and instead of UL, what I'll do is I will say, say LI A IMG, right? I mean, you could have left the UL there. That's fine, right? So this is the full descendant tree, the image that's inside the anchor, that's inside the list item, that's inside the UL, inside the global nav, right? So that means that I can tell it to be a certain size, right? I can say width, and if I tell it to be 100%, it'll be 100% of the anchor, which will be 100% of its list item, and so on. And right now those don't have limited widths either. So if I tell the picture right now to be, you know, a percentage, let's say 70%, it's going to get smaller, but it's not going to be the way that you necessarily would want it. So what we might want to do is make this so that it's not based on the image. Let's go ahead and let's get rid of this. And instead, let's just do it so that we're telling the list item itself how big to be. All right. And let's say that for the list item that's inside of the global nav, we will say that the width is, I don't know, let's say 40 pixels or something like that. Okay, and automatically it gets smaller. Now it's still behaving weirdly, right? It still doesn't look like it's behaving properly. Here, let's grab this edge. It's still confused, or it's not confused. We're confused by the way it looks, because we need to make it so that it is that these are floating elements. Get rid of the list item bullet. So let's say list style. First of all, let's get rid of the list style, and we'll say none, right? And that gets rid of that little bullet that was over there. And then the next thing is that we can go ahead and say that we're going to have those list elements or list items float to the left, like that, all right? And then now the thing is that you'll see, I don't know if you can tell over here in my live preview, you can see the columns for the 1, 2, 3, the little list items, but it looks like the picture files are not conforming. So what we need to do then is we need to tell those pictures how big to be. So we'll come down here, and I'm going to just copy this so I can use that as part of the descendant tree. And then I'm going to say A, IMG, and for this we can tell it to be width of, let's just say for right now, let's say 100%. Okay, and you see that they immediately get smaller and they fit their containing elements. Now the other thing that I could do is I could add padding to that. If I wanted, I could say padding, oops, and let's do like 5 pixels or something like that, and see that's a little bit better. The other thing I can do is I can say display block, so that there's no weird space underneath that might show up later if I want to make these things look a little bit different. Okay, all right, so that's not too bad. And then if I wanted to also make sure that if I click over here and I can test these, I can also style the anchor tag as well. And I'm just going to copy this part of the tree, and I'll come here and I'll paste that. And then I will go ahead and say display block so that they behave as a block also, because remember that anchors are inline. So we'll say display block like that. And the other thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to put, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste, I'm going to make a hover state. So we'll say a hover like this, and instead of display block, let's just get rid of that for a second. I'm going to give it a background color so that it does a different background color. And I'm just going to paste this color in, and you'll see that it's this sort of bright blue color. And whenever I come back over here, you'll see that I get a hover state. Let me open this up a little bit so you can see it a little bit more. And I get this hover state. And you'll also notice that this weird thing is happening where it's almost like it's misbehaving. It's got all this extra space. And the reason is because these pictures are too gigantic right now, so that's one of the reasons why it's doing this weird scrolling thing. But you will also notice that these don't feel like they're actually on the page, so that we need to address that too. And if you wanted to like give these, see how these original icons, if I blow this up, they have like a border radius. We could also give this a border radius as well. So we could say that the A tag, we can do it on the original. We can say that the border radius, let's see, border radius like this is, I don't say like, say 8 pixels or something like that. So now whenever I hover over it, you see that I get a border radius on it. And I think 8 might be a little bit heavy. Let's try 6. And I think I like that a little bit better, right? So you end up getting this hover around it, which is kind of interesting, right? All right, so now the other thing too, if I zoom back out over here, the other thing too that's happening is I said this is going off the edge, and I don't want that to happen. So I need to look at the actual UL position. Right now I've got right at 0, so maybe I need to bump that over. So on the right side, let's see what happens if we do about 35 pixels, and that might look okay, maybe even 40. Let's see, and that might be okay. And then for the top, if you wanted to make this a little bit more centered, you could knock this down, let's say to 10 pixels. Maybe that's a bit much, maybe 5. And the reason I'm doing this part in pixels is because you'll notice that everything else, that basically I set the height in pixels, and so because it is set in pixels, which is an absolute unit of measure, it's not relative, I can do the other things in pixels too, since it doesn't really scroll or do a whole lot of other things, right? And so I think that that might be a good place for right now. And then if I wanted to do a test, I could make sure that in fact everything is scrolling underneath. So far so good. And if I wanted to go ahead and do this, I can go ahead and set a z-index because I will eventually need to. So I'm going to set a z-index on the entire global nav. So where it says position fixed, I will come just below that and I'll say z-index. And I'm going to set it to, let's say 800. I like to do, and it doesn't have a unit of measure, by the way. Z-index is just a flat number. I like to do, whenever I'm doing z-indexes, units that are like in hundreds, so that I have plenty of extra room if later I come and I make something and I have to slip something in between two other things. Like if I have 800, 900, I could slip something in at 850, right? Or 100, 200, 300, 400, and so on. It gives me plenty of room, and I like to go and not exceed like 999 as the unit of measure. So, all right, that'll show you that shows you how you can set up this fixed part down below to make a sticky footer. Well, it's not a footer technically; it's a nav, a sticky nav at the bottom. And then let's get going with this other stuff so that we can see how to maybe make these images a little bit more manageable and how we can get that header set up.